Hey guys, how's it going? Today I'd like to share with you two watercolor heart cards with puzzle elements. I'll be starting off today by embossing my watercolor paper. And if you'd like to skip right to the watercoloring of the hearts, I'll place a timestamp below. To emboss today's image, I'll need my stamping tool. And this is a piece of watercolor paper. This is Strathmore cold press watercolor paper that's about 7 inches square. I'll begin prepping this for embossing with my dedicated paintbrush. And what this does is it eliminates any little pieces of debris that might be on the paper. I'll come in next with some powder, and I haven't invested in a anti-static powder tool yet, but I wanted to try out powder for embossing. So in my little container, I have some baby powder, and I'm using a oval wash brush just to spread it over the entire cardstock. The image that I'll be embossing today is Simon Says Stamp Heart to Heart Background Cling Rubber Stamp. This stamp is 6 inches square. And once I have that adhered to the door of my stamping tool, I'll come in with some Versamark ink and close that stamping tool over. With that image well inked onto my watercolor paper, I'll come in with some Recollections Gold Detail Embossing Powder. And I just want to spread this liberally over my entire watercolor paper. Spread it around and knock off the excess. I'll then come in with my heat tool to set the entire image. And when I come in with my heat tool, I want to make sure that I'm working really methodically across this entire background. I want to make sure that all of the powder is set. With that embossing powder well set, I'll come in with some painter's tape and tape this piece of watercolor paper onto my glass mat. You could also use a hardboard or a drawing board if you have one. And this is why it was important to leave that gap between the stamped image and the edge of the paper to accommodate the tape. And typically I like to run my watercolor paper through a laminator after I've watercolored, but since I've embossed an image onto this watercolor paper, I'm no longer able to do that. So it's really important that I keep this piece of paper from curling. And watercolor paper tends to curl a little bit the more water that you add to it. Today I'm using Distress Oxide inks in the colors Milled Lavender, Wilted Violet, Seedless Preserves, Picked Raspberry, Worn Lipstick, and Dusty Concord. I'll also need a little bit of water. I prefer to work with a little bit of water on my glass mat. And today I'm using a number 9 round brush. And before I introduce any color onto these hearts, I'm picking one heart and covering the heart with water. This will enable the pigment to move and to blend more easily since it's being introduced into water. It's the water that pulls it down, that blends it out. I want most of the pigment to be deposited at the top of the heart. And I'll give my brush a quick wipe and come in with some clean water and pull that pigment down. And I'm making sure to follow the contours of the heart as I pull that pigment down. Moving on to the next heart, I haven't cleaned my brush because I'm staying within the same color. I am choosing to work away from the heart that I originally colored because this gives that previously painted heart a chance to dry. And again, I'm filling this heart with some water before coming in with some pigment. And the thing that I really like about having an embossed image to watercolor, it's really easy to blend the colors when I want to, and it's really easy to have certain hearts stand alone when I want them to as well. The rule of thumb is I'm always depositing the pigment at the top and pulling it down. In this case, when I'm painting a heart that has a lot of overlapping hearts on it as well, I definitely want to make sure to let it dry a little bit, because adding so much water in this one area could potentially cause bleeding and blending where I don't want it. I still want those clean, crisp lines with the embossing. For this next heart, I'm choosing not to fill the little heart with water because I want that to be a different standalone color, but I'm still filling the rest of the heart with water. I'll then come in with my pigment to deposit that pigment at the top of the heart and pull it down. Now I did end up going a little bit too fast, and I did get a little bit of this seedless preserves on the little heart that I wanted to be standalone. And that's okay, especially with the distress products. If you make a mistake, they're fairly easy to pick up with a dry, clean paper towel as long as you pick them up right away. And since it took me a little longer to get around that little heart than I anticipated, the top of the heart on the left did have a chance to dry. And as you can see, it's not blending very well on the left-hand side. And two things can cause this to happen. Either not enough water was added initially to help that pigment blend, or the water and the pigment dried before you had a chance to pull it down. Usually the pigment can be re-wet, especially with the oxide products, and pulled down to blend out. Certain watercolor paints are a little bit tougher to do so. And if it's not working to pull it down just with water, you can always pick up a little bit of pigment with a little bit of water, and again, starting at the top, pull that pigment and that water down and you'll have a smoother blend. So I've now gotten to the part where portions of the heart that I'm currently painting have already been painted with another color. And I'm still going to deposit most of the pigment at the top of the heart. I like to start where the hearts overlap, and if the portion of the heart that I'm coloring ever overlaps into a new heart of a different color, I like to take the opportunity to clean my brush. So this helps prevent the muddying of my blends. Once I have the portions of the heart that overlap with others painted, I then come in and pull that pigment down. In this case, I did have to add a little bit more of the pigment near the bottom and the sides, just because where I was pulling from overlapped with other hearts and I didn't want to pull that blended color down. When I have to add more pigment, I like to make sure either I first paint the area with clean water or add water to the pigment before I apply it to my heart. And with the heart background painted completely, I chose to dry this with my heat tool, and I have to be careful because I do have that embossing powder on there and I don't want to melt it if possible. You could also let it air dry. I'm feeling it with my hands to check for any cool spots, because any cool spots on my watercolor paper indicate that that area is still really damp. I'll come in now with this heart puzzle die, and I want to find an area that I like. I found this heart puzzle die on Amazon, and once I found an area that I like, I'll go ahead and tape that down. So I then took a piece of white cardstock and die cut this stitched rectangle using Lawn Fawn outside in stitched rectangle stackable die. And this is the largest die. The outside of this rectangle measures 5.5 by 4.25 inches, but it cuts a piece of cardstock that's a little bit smaller. So I'll go ahead and run that through the die cut machine. And I also want to prepare part of my sentiment. So I'm preparing this black piece of cardstock for embossing as I did before. And I'll come in with Simon Says Stamp You Matter Clear Stamp Set. And I chose I Love and 2 pieces. And once I have the position of these stamps on my cardstock, I'll go ahead and ink up these stamps with Versamark ink. And for this card, I'll emboss the sentiment using Ranger White embossing powder. I also chose this sentiment for the second card, but I chose a different embossing powder. And after setting those with my heat tool, I'll go ahead and trim those down just with my paper trimmer as well as some scissors. I then chose to trace the outline of the heart die onto my card front so I'd know the placement of the puzzle heart. If I were to make this card again, I would choose a little bit different order of operations. I would have done the embossing for my sentiment, found the placement of my heart, and then cut out the heart puzzle. But for this card, this is where we're at. So I traced that with a pencil. And off camera, I did go and place all of the pieces of the heart puzzle back into the die just so that I would know where they were. And I found out the hard way that this particular die does have 2 pieces that are shaped exactly the same, but I was able to switch them around in time before the glue set. The thing that may be a little bit challenging to wrap your head around with this card is the pieces in the puzzle die have to be glued down, mirrored to how they're laying beside the card front. Once you get going, it's easy peasy to flip it around in your brain, and you can always look at the pattern to make sure that you're placing the pieces in the right place. This puzzle die does cut the pieces rather loosely, so to ensure that I have proper piece placement, I glued down the pieces of the top portion of the heart and went down a little bit, and then went to the opposite side of the heart and went down a little bit, finally ending at the bottom on both sides of the heart. And the nice thing about using liquid adhesive is you can kind of push them together a little bit if you need a little bit of a different fit in some places. With that heart puzzle complete, I can come in and erase the remaining pencil lines and glue down my embossed portion of the sentiment. And for you, I chose the word you from Simon Says Stamp. And I chose to die cut that from metallic gold cardstock. And once I run that through the die cut machine, I'll adhere that down with Tombow liquid adhesive. I wanted to create a mat for this card, so I chose 2 stitched rectangles to create a frame out of pink metallic cardstock. And once I've run that through the die cut machine, I adhered that with liquid adhesive and attached the whole card front to a card base. For the second card, I'm using Hero Art's Fancy Dies puzzle die. And I'll go ahead and tape that to the remaining background. Now, this isn't going to create a perfect rectangle because we cut a heart out of the background already, and that's okay because I know that I only want a slim rectangle for my card. So the nice thing about this die is that the pieces don't fall out once it's come through the die cut machine. These pieces actually have to be pulled apart a little bit, and the edge pieces created by this die have to be trimmed down to be released. I don't want any of the pieces to be released, so I'm going to go ahead and take a scrap piece of cardstock and adhere it to the back of the puzzle pieces using liquid adhesive. And with those puzzle pieces secured together, I can go ahead and trim down this piece of cardstock as much as I want without any fear of losing puzzle pieces. And as I cut the bottom piece, I'm making sure that I create a nice straight edge. I'm cutting off all the little projections and the little sort of valleys of the puzzle pieces. And I'm free to cut along the edge pieces of both the top and both of the sides of this piece of cardstock. I did decide that I wanted the rectangle to be a little bit slimmer. So I came in and cut off one more row of puzzle pieces just to create a slimmer look. And again, I'm making that cut so I create edge pieces on the cardstock that I'm going to use. To create the stitching on the 2 short edges of this piece of cardstock, I used the same die I used to create the card front. I had to make sure that everything was square. And to make sure that it was square, I taped down my piece of cardstock to my cutting plate, making sure that my piece of cardstock was square to my cutting plate. I also used my T-ruler to make sure that my die was square to the edge of my cutting plate, because if everything is square to the edge of your cutting plate, the die cut will also be square. And I just wanted stitching on the short edges of this rectangle, so I wanted to make sure that the long edges were not touching the die. And since this is the same die that I used to create my card front, the edges match up perfectly. And I just need to adhere that down with some liquid adhesive. And again, I want to make sure that it's square by using my T-ruler. The last remaining thing that is different in this card compared to the first card is I need to adhere the final puzzle piece. And once that final puzzle piece was adhered with liquid adhesive, I went ahead and adhered the sentiments as well as the mat to complete this card. And that concludes today's project. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions, please let me know. We'll see you next time. Bye for now.